Hello, and welcome to week 48 of our 2 year Bible study. We're in the midst of Proverbs, looking at Proverbs 7 through 15 today. Just as a reminder, Proverbs is one of the four wisdom books in Scripture, and Proverbs lays out how normatively we can live our life in a way that is pleasing to God. It gets offset by the book of Job, where most of his friends actually give recommendations that would be in very much alignment with the book of Proverbs. But just because you follow the wisdom of God doesn't mean you're not going to go through suffering. And so Job deals with suffering. But we don't want to think of all of life as suffering because there are joys in life. For instance, the joy of a spouse and the relationship that the spouses have. And so that's offset with that joy of the Song of Songs. However, if all we do is pursue pleasure or happiness in our lives, then everything becomes meaningless in Ecclesiastes. And so Ecclesiastes says, follow God, fear God, and follow his path. Well, how do we fear God and follow his path? Well, the book of Proverbs tells us to do that. And so these um, wisdom books are kind of circular, necessarily offsetting each other. Book of Proverbs is written to Solomon's son, who is a young man with the world and all of its temptations before him. And throughout the book, there are two women who are calling out to him, wisdom and folly. So for the first 9 chapters, the two women and the paths that they travel are described. And then in chapters 10 through 30 are insights on how life is changed by either wisdom or folly. Chapters 10 through 15 talk primarily about the actions and consequences with a strong focus on God. And this is how you establish a good life. Chapter 16 through 29 talk about exceptions to the rules. So a strong focus on the king judging well. So when life doesn't go right, we need somebody who's going to give us guidance. Oftentimes in ancient times, the king would be the one to do that. And so 16 through 19 are these exceptions to the rules. And then 30 and 31, we come back to the original emphasis on the two women of wisdom and folly. And chapters 30 and 31 talk about finding the right woman, and the right woman obviously being wisdom, but folly still being an option. And then chapter 31 becomes the embodiment of wisdom in a godly wife. So we left off at Proverbs 6, so we'll pick up at Proverbs 7 today. And in Proverbs 7, it talks about avoiding the temptation of the adulterous woman. In Proverbs chapter 8, it talks about listening to wisdom, who has existed since the beginning. And notice the contrast with the woman of folly in chapter 7, where the woman of folly is trying to bring down the reader. In Proverbs chapter 8, wisdom has existed since the beginning and is foundational to our understanding of life, and also brings purpose and fulfillment to us. In Proverbs chapter 9, we have the most distinct of the two calls of wisdom and folly. Both wisdom and folly sit at the highest point of the city, the apex of the city. And this is where the temples typically are. So wisdom has already been associated as a characteristic of God in chapter 8. And so this is either a worship of God, a worship of wisdom, who's at the apex of the city, or a wisdom of idols or folly, who are at the apex of the city. So now Solomon has shifted it from not just wisdom and folly, but who is it that we worship? And when we worship the one true God, that's where wisdom lies. When we worship anyone or anything else, that's where folly lies. Well, Proverbs 10 starts talking about a contrast of consequences for wisdom and folly. And several of the chapters that are going to come after this continue on with these contrasts between the consequences of wisdom and folly. Same thing in Proverbs chapter 11. And you can notice how the rewards for the wise are often not material rewards, but rather character rewards. So the rewards of wisdom is changing and transforming who the person is, not what the person gets. And this oftentimes is a distinction between what wisdom and folly are offering. Wisdom is offering for us to become the people that God created us to be. Folly offers us pleasures and good things and blessings in this life, but with nothing that it all passes away, either in our own time or after we die. Chapter 12 and chapter 13, there is a continuation again of the contrast of different consequences. And you can note that the fool does, when it talks about the fool, it doesn't mean a simpleton or somebody who lacks intellect. So we're not talking, the fool is not necessarily somebody who does poorly at school. We oftentimes kind of think of it that way, like the dunce, right? Um, but rather, foolishness is rebelliousness towards God. So you could be a highly intelligent person and still be foolish. You could be an older person who we would normally think of as being wise and still be very foolish. So the foolish or wisdom has nothing to do with age, doesn't have anything to do with intellect, it doesn't have anything to do with socioeconomic situations. These can contribute to some degree of wisdom or experience, but if we are in rebelliousness towards God, then that always, according to the book of Proverbs, always results in foolishness. And then we finish off at least today's study with Proverbs 14 and 15. And again, in these two chapters, there are just a contrast of consequences between following wisdom and following folly.